everyone. Welcome to today's part 2 of Exploring the Inner Addict with Lisa Sarimi. My name is Nicole, and I'm on the Access Elite team that has brought this event to you. For those of you who aren't familiar, Access Elite is a health and wellness company providing team building, social wellness, and connection through our on-demand and live events. We at Access Elite are always so excited to bring some positivity and connection to your day. So let's jump right in. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest. Lisa is a transformational coach, marriage and family therapist, and a yoga therapist. And with that, Lisa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Today, we're going to be going deeper into this exploration of our inner addict in our 4-part series. We're in the second part of that today. So let me get the screen shared and we'll just dive right in. So this is a 4-part series. Today we're going to be really focused on the addictive cycle. Last week, dimensions of the inner addict is what we went over. And then next week, we'll be going through manifestations of addiction. So we'll talk a little bit about it today too, but like the different ways that addiction can manifest in our lives. And then we'll finalize everything with ways to help regulate our own inner addicts. And a lot of the information, this is a really good book called Addict America. It's by Dr. Carol Clark. And she does a really beautiful job at talking about addiction and how it's literally inbred in our society today. Today, we'll do a little review, in case you weren't with us last week, on the addiction piece and the archetype. Anyway, I'll get into the review of last week, basically. And then this is your brain on drugs. So we're going to talk about some of the pharmacology in our brain and the operation of the addictive cycle. And then the chicken and the egg, which came first. And we'll finalize things with diving into control versus connection. So as a review, I just want to review the definition of addiction that I work with a lot. We went over several of them last week, but it is by Dr. Carol Clark, and she says, obsessive, compulsive, out of control behavior that is done in spite of negative consequences to yourself or to others. Obsessive compulsive, out of control behavior done in spite of negative consequences to yourself or to others. So notice how this definition does not say anything about substance abuse. It says out of control behavior. Last week, we talked about the archetypal addict, like what is the addict archetype? And an archetype is a behavioral pattern that kind of exists in our collective. So when you hear the word addict, you might already have some ideas of what that might look like for you. Now, there are light attributes and there are shadow attributes of the addict. The light attributes are really that the addict really can help recognize and confront the addictive behavior. It's that ability to kind of pull themselves out of the addiction. And on the shadow side, the addictive pattern, it takes over one's inner spirit. It takes over their integrity, their honesty, and their ability to really deeply connect to themselves and to others. So there was also a discussion last week about how this addict archetype has a dance between control and chaos. The addiction becomes their sense of control, maybe in the midst of chaos, and yet there is some comfort in chaos. They might actually create chaos, yet there is this deep relationship to wanting to be in control. We looked at maybe what some of our own inner addict dimensions might be. We looked at, well, what are some of our cravings, right? Because cravings, that's a normal thing that all humans have. And it's also normal that at times we might take those cravings and go out of balance in our lives, and we feel it, right? But the addict's voice, when you hear the inner voice say deserve or what about me, then we might start to consider, what is this behavior or this substance or this pattern, and is it becoming an addictive pattern or addictive cycle? And today, the information we will cover is going to help you have a better sense of, when does a behavior become an addiction? So the addiction we see today, it's primarily from a substance or a behavior. But one of the main things is that there is intense stimulation from that behavior or that substance. So how does somebody become an addict when there's no substance causing the stimulation? Well, it has to do a lot with the brain and the different parts of our brain and the series of unfolding that happens. So if we think back to the caveman didn't have substances. They didn't eat excessive food because they had to hunt for their food. They didn't have alcohol or drugs. However, they still did get a natural high. They got it from exercise. They got it from love, or they got it from hunting or in the presence of a dangerous animal, maybe like a saber-toothed tiger. Well, how the heck did they do that? It's the myriad chemicals that are released when we get into certain states. And those chemicals actually create the feeling of being high, like adrenaline is one of them, for example. So when we seek stimulation, and we might even find that we seek it from a negative event, which is an interesting thing. One of the things that we're finding a lot today is that people are being addicted to things like work or to stress, right? Why? Because there's a myriad of events that happen in our physiology when we get stressed, or sometimes when we're even in a fight, right? That it doesn't sound like a favorable state to be in, but that pharmacology that gets released in the body can eventually start to become an addiction. And you'll understand why today. So one example of this would be, how many times have you heard somebody say that they work better under pressure? Or how many people do you know, maybe you're one of them, that fills their schedule to the brim? And there's this sense of go, 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 go all the time. So opening up the mind to the different ways that this pattern may unfold in our minds, in our lives, and within ourselves, each and every one of us. So it's the stimulation. Stimulation is just something that triggers a response. There's no story or narrative about it. It's just something that triggers a response. And it only triggers a chemical response in our brains that may be modified by the thoughts or the beliefs that we associate with it. I just want to say that one more time. So it only triggers a chemical response in the brain that may be modified by the thoughts or the beliefs that we associate with it. So there's this relationship to what is actually happening, and then what is the narrative, the thoughts, and the beliefs that we associate with what is happening. Because it's the thought or the belief that dictates a mood response. Now, what this response is going to do is it's going to move us from baseline either up or down. So when it creates an upward departure from baseline, it's a stimulation. And as that stimulation recedes, our mood returns to baseline. Now, the caveman brain recognizes that the stimulation from the chemical release, I'm sorry, let me say that again. The caveman, I can't talk. The caveman's brain recognizes that stimulation from the release of dopamine and adrenaline. So the stimulation happens, and these hormones, dopamine and adrenaline, are released. So any stimulating event, a memory of an event, or even an anticipation of the future, can cause a mood elevation from baseline. So let's make sure that we got that. When there is something that happens in our world, and it's a stimulating type of event. So maybe it's a stressful event, maybe it's using a substance, maybe it's an argument, anything that creates stimulation. The caveman part of our brain, the limbic system, recognizes that stimulation, and it releases dopamine and adrenaline. Now, dopamine is a feel-good kind of associated hormone, and adrenaline also kind of gets us amped up, right? So the thing that's so interesting about us as human beings is that this thing could be happening, or it could just be a memory or an anticipation. But that response in the physiology is going to happen right now. By the way, conversely, when there is no stimulation, it can cause depression. And our baseline over time, if you can imagine being in that constant state of stimulation, our baseline over time changes, and we need more, and we need more, and we need more. So the heart of the addiction is actually the dopamine that our own pharmacology produces as a response to stimulation. Now, our brain is made up of neurotransmitters, think of those as senders, and neuroreceptors, think of those as the receivers. The transmitters actually receive a signal from one of your five senses, or a thought, and then it's sent to the receptor to activate a response. The caveman limbic part of our brain recognizes the stimulation from the chemicals that are released, that dopamine and that adrenaline. I don't know why I keep changing the way I pronounce it. Adrenaline. So any stimulating event, memory, or anticipation will cause this mood elevation from our baseline. And again, just to hone it in the absence of the stimulation will actually create depression. So a response is programmed in the limbic system, that caveman part of our brain, and it makes the association between activity and feelings of pleasure. And then when that's repeated over and over and over again, it's called conditioning. The enlightened part of our brain, which is the thinking part of our brain right here, it makes meaning of that stimulation and associates it to pleasure. Now, this right here is at the heart of the addictive pattern. It actually creates this addictive pattern, and it becomes firmly established. And there arises something that one wants to escape from. It might be boredom, it might be frustration, a bad relationship, a painful memory, fill in the blank. There are so many things that we are trying to kind of get away from, right? And the addiction happens when we go to those things and the pharmacology of our own brain begins to release these hormones like dopamine and adrenaline. I did it again. And so over time, we end up in this rivet where it feels insatiable. We need more and more. So a lot of the addiction we actually see today is actually a result also of substances. Let me reframe that. A lot of the addiction to substance, or a lot of the substance abuse that we see today, is a result a lot of times of that substance being enhanced for the purpose of intensifying the stimulation. So people are onto this. So cigarettes are a great example, right? Like the Native Americans used to smoke tobacco. They did it ceremonial. They brought ritual to the practice. They weren't smoking the tobacco because they were stressed out, right? Or to escape from something. And then what happened was, over time, Marlboro got involved. They figured a few things out. They figured out how to increase the stimulation of nicotine by enhancing the tobacco. And voila, cigarettes. And we know the story of cigarettes. So any stimulating event, memory of an event, or an anticipation is going to pull you away from baseline. And we want to kind of bring that enlightened brain back on so that we're not creating these default patterns that get really riveted deep with those connections of dopamine, connections to pleasure and stimulation. So at first, the stimulation causes that feel-good hormone, the dopamine, and eventually the addict's brain doesn't care anymore what is causing the stimulation. It just wants it. The chicken or the egg. The addict's brain puts into motion a chain of events to continually find stimulation. And it'll find a replacement if a regular one isn't available. So I want to just make a comment right here. You know, the 12-step program is a really powerful program. It's helped so many people overcome so much addiction and so much self-harm. Now, it is very focused, like, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, on a particular substance, right? So somebody that might go to AA, they might come off of drinking. However, the inner addict is still craving stimulation. So they might start to find different ways to express the inner addiction or the inner addict. So that could be nicotine. That could be relationships. It could be coffee. It could be sex. We're going to get into process addiction today. So when I'm talking about the inner addict, I'm not talking about substance abuse. I'm talking about this, I used to call mine the inner gremlin, this part of ourselves that is addicted to stimulation. And when we really look at our lives, we can see when it becomes an addiction. It's one thing to move towards stimulation. It's another thing when the relationship becomes addictive. And we'll know because of the definition that we started with, right? So addiction is not linear. It's not something that happens A to Z. It's actually very circular. And the addict doesn't need to just respond to circumstances. They'll actually create circumstances to support their use of that behavior or that substance. And so maybe now you can understand Addict America, the lost connection, how as a nation, right, there is a lot of external stimulation all the time. And so many of us can easily become addicted to some of these things like technology, right? Like the social media platforms over and over again, the bings and the dings. And that actually still creates that same chain of events that we just talked about in our bodies. So the addict is always dealing with control for sure, right? And as humans, I think we all seek control because control in general is really just about feeling safe, right? When we feel like we are in control, we feel safe. And when we don't, there's fear. And fear is at the root of all of our problems. It's at the root of anger. Anger is just the tip of the iceberg, because anger is a way to protect ourselves, right, from those things that are deeply seated that we fear. Now, let's just go to the biggest fear of them all, our existential fears. The fears of not being enough, not being worthless, being worthless, being unlovable. The fear of being abandoned or being alone. Being alone is probably one of the biggest that we have. And with COVID, it hasn't helped, right? There's been a lot of people that have had to go through some really, really tough spaces, and they've had to do it alone. You know, as human beings, we're actually social animals. We thrive on connection, and we are communal by nature. In fact, we need each other to live. We rely on each other to meet our basic needs, and also our higher needs, like our social needs, our need for love and affirmation. In fact, we exist in each other's existence, if that makes sense. So our human connection, it's a driving factor for every aspect of our existence. And it's our fear of being exiled or being excluded from our tribe or our group that is the motivator truly behind all of our behavior. We fear being alone, and this fear will eventually overrule personal beliefs and ethics even. So you might just take a moment and just notice, how does this fear live in you? I mean, it's a condition of being human. Our entire design is about protection. Whoops. I don't know what just happened. Hold on. Okay, there's a slide missing. I don't know where it went. Let me go to the topic and I'll just talk about it. Or maybe I did. Hold on. I'm sorry, guys. No, I did. This just threw me off. Okay. So I hope that today, and I want to open it up for some questions, gave you a sense of like the cycle of addiction, the different ways addiction between today and last week, can show up in our worlds, right? It can exist in the form of substances, but can also exist in the form of behavior, right? And it can show up right now. One of the things that we're really, really as a nation dealing with is addiction to stimulation in general. And it doesn't get named and it doesn't get labeled because we have had this other way of looking at things. In fact, like if you go to a doctor and they're going to diagnose addiction, it's not called addiction, it's called substance abuse. So how do you diagnose addiction to being busy or addiction to stress in the DSM, which is a book that gives us as a collective a way to define or label certain diagnoses. So this is really, we look inside and we see like, where are we moving towards constant stimulation? Is it picking your nails? Is it playing with your hair? Is it whatever it is that takes you out of being present and really just being willing to look and then to notice? Because how it becomes an addiction, once again, is the myriad of chemical reactions that happen in our internal compass or internal selves. And then we get addicted to the dopamine release and the adrenaline release that happens when we're going through that behavior. So next week, we're going to then open up, well, what are some of these behaviors, right? I just talked about a few things, but like we'll really talk deeper about process addictions, love addiction, being addicted to being busy. What are these different ways that it might actually manifest in our worlds? And then we'll finalize it with the last part of our series with ways to help regulate the inner addict. So I'm going to just share that a lot of the work that I do is really informed by yogic practices, really as a way to find ways to better understand and regulate ourselves, because yoga really is research of the self. And then I also work with the depth psychological lens, which really hones in the imaginal realms and works with myth and metaphor and symbol and ways to deepen meaning and purpose in our lives. I always offer all of the Access Elite members a discount. So just let me know if you reach out for a personal session, and I will make sure to give you that discount as well. And I'll hand it back to Nicole if anyone has any questions or anything like that. Feel free to, I think, just have them either chat or type it in the chat or unmute themselves, right, Nicole?
Yeah. If anyone has any questions, comments that they have, feel free to unmute yourself or send a chat to either Lisa and I. And we can take a few minutes here to discuss anything that might have come up for you.
Everyone's quiet today.
I know sometimes when you take in information like this too, it's just a lot to absorb, and then questions come up later and you have to let it sink in. So feel free to always email our team as well, or Lisa at that email you can see on her screen right now, if you do have questions that come up later.
I think a couple popped on. Do you ladies have any questions today?
I have a question. It's Kyoko again.
Hi, Kyoko.
Hi, thank you. Last week, I said it's kind of addiction, like I like to be busy.
Yes.
But do you think there is a reason why I keep them busy prefer? So
yeah, I was actually thinking about that, because I remember you saying that in your culture, there's a lot of influence. And what I was thinking about is, how does that actually become a cultural way versus an addiction? And today really kind of is the day that spoke to that, because if busyness is a stimulation, right? And then if we're constantly busy, that stimulation can also become kind of an escapism, a way to not deal with things, right? So we have to look inward and notice, okay, is that what we're doing? Number one. Number two, also, that stimulation can release that feel-good dopamine response within your own system. And so it's not even what we're doing. I mean, it could be anything, really. I mean, food is another thing. I didn't really talk about food, but anything that gives us that stimulation and releases the dopamine, then over time, what happens is we want to feel good. So we keep going towards that dopamine release, and we do the things that help us get it, and some of those things are obvious because they show up as alcoholism and drug addictions and stuff like that. But it almost feels like, these are the unconscious things, right? These are the picking at somebody's cuticles. I have a client that, she rips her cuticles apart. And she's addicted to it. It's not nice. It doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good, right? But she's gotten to a place where it's become kind of a crutch and a tool, and she's gotten into that addictive cycle with the behavior. Did that help, Kyoko?
Yeah, I was thinking of it when earlier you were saying, maybe I'm escaping something, to being busy, and I need to start thinking about how what I'm thinking of behind my mind.
Yeah, like, what am I running from? The answers are inside. It just kind of have to do a little work to get them sometimes.
Yeah,
But
I
Lisa,
really think about it.
I was thinking, you one does things to make oneself feel better, right? But I guess as long as it doesn't, like you were saying, either hurt somebody or hurt you, uh, there's a balance for things, right? Like you said, like it gives you a rush of dopamine. Let's say when you open Instagram or you open social media and you see like pretty things, and you're like, oh my God, I'm dreaming about these things. But as long as it doesn't interfere maybe with your work or your studies or your family, it's okay every once in a while, I guess, to get that little rush of dopamine.
Yes, yeah, that's why I always start with the definition. I have it right in front of me of addiction. Obsessive, compulsive, out of control behavior done in spite of negative consequences or to self or others. So I like to have ice cream every now and again. That makes me feel good. It stimulates me and it gives me pleasure. But I'm not addicted to it because it's not like I eat it first thing when I wake up. I'm not, my health isn't compromised because of the amount of ice cream that I'm eating. I'm not stealing ice cream from other people. It's like there's no negative effects. Like you were saying, Camila, I can have some ice cream every now and again. It's cool. I can enjoy that. And it's okay if the dopamine gets released. But it's when it becomes, have either or any of you ever felt out of control? Like I've also had ice cream and felt out of control. No, Camille says no. Okay. Yeah. And some people do and some people don't. But it's this, so when you think about addiction, I want you to think of it more like the stimulation that the behavior is giving you, the behavior or the substance. Behavior or substance is giving you stimulation. And then we now know what happens in the brain, right? Now, when it starts to become obsessive and compulsive, a lot of people these days, they do plastic surgery and augmentations, at the local plastic surgeon. They're not just plastic surgeons, but they go get fillers and Botox and stuff like that. And then have you ever seen someone where you can tell like they've gotten obsessive and compulsive? Okay, right? So it went from doing something that kind of might give them a little feel good, maybe they look a little better, to now they look weird, and they're not done. They're not tattooing. Have you ever heard of somebody get a tattoo and then all of a sudden they want more tattoos? And then sometimes you see people, they get all tattooed up after the first tattoo. Well, this can happen, right? Not everybody does that, but every now and again, somebody can become addictive. It's not to the tattoo, it's to the high of getting it.
Got it.
Yeah. And next week we'll kind of look at we'll look at this stuff more.
I was just thinking about tattoos and how they can be really addictive for people, especially like when people have all the personal little like stick and poke kits and everything like that. Yeah, so interesting.
Wow.
It all happens in different packages for us all, so it's a good reflection point to kind of dive in and see what is that trigger for us.
Gambling's another one. It gets complicated when the behavior or the addiction becomes something that we need, right? So if we need to eat, right? Yeah. So if somebody has food addiction, that's a more complicated addiction to have, or love addiction, sex addiction. I mean, these are things that are kind of fundamental in even our own basic needs, right? So, yeah.
So something from escape. They want to escape from something. That's why they're addicted to something else.
Mm-hmm.
It's. I would even take the word escape out and say that it's a coping. This is a way that they have learned to cope, truly from actually being disconnected on some level.
Mm-hmm.
We experience an event where something happens, we feel disconnection, and it hurts. And then we find ways to numb that out, to cope with that, to deal with the pain, you know. And sometimes that's drugs, and sometimes that's being angry, and sometimes that's working, and sometimes that's eating, and sometimes that's starving yourself, and sometimes that's picking your cuticles, sometimes like what, you know. It's just so it's interesting because a lot of people that are in a 12-step program, it's beautiful, right? They complete with, like, think about alcohol. Okay, you don't have to drink alcohol to survive, but love addiction, you need relationships to survive, right? So that inner addict energy can shift to something else. So just because somebody is dry, it doesn't mean that they're in recovery. Because being in recovery is tending to the inner addict, not just getting rid of a substance.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That's always very informative and very helpful.
Good news, bad news.
Yes, I'm excited to dive in more next week, Tuesday, part 3 with you.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you guys have any more questions before we go today?
I just want to say your butterfly looks great behind you. It looks like it's growing up.
Yeah.
I love that one. It's a blue mofo.
Wow.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.
Yes, have a great one.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.